Was peace possible in Westeros? Can I, a former peacebuilding advisor with the US government, help make things better for the people of the Seven Kingdoms? Today I'm going to give it my best shot. Come along and see how I do in this, the series finale of Stabilizing Westeros. Welcome to the final episode of Stabilizing Westeros. I'm Madeline Vellturo, and if you've made it this far, you likely know that I am a former stabilization advisor with the US government, using the skills and tools I used to use in my day job to address the dramatic, gory conflicts we all know from film and television. If you're new to the series, you can navigate here to catch up on the conflict analysis we've performed over the past 4 videos, applying the Fund for Peace's Fragile States Index to the Seven Kingdoms of Westeros. Today, it's time to put that analysis to use and to build a stabilization plan. Throughout this series, I have been framing the core question as, can we prevent the War of the Five Kings? But today, I admit to you that framing has been a bit disingenuous. In violence prevention, we don't ask ourselves, can we prevent a war? But instead, we ask ourselves, what can we do to prevent or reduce violence? As I've said before, not every war is preventable, but there is always something you can do to reduce the risk of harm, violence against civilians, or injustice. I've noticed in the comments what I would call some perfectionist expectations regarding stability, reflections that war is inevitable, that peace isn't possible, or that in order to achieve stability, you must achieve this one thing and only this one thing, are very indicative of the types of feedback and criticisms and even guidance that conflict experts would get working for the government. But they also misinterpret one of the core functions of peacebuilding work, and honestly, one of the most difficult parts of the job, which is accepting imperfection and trying hard anyway. So for this exercise, I invite you to join me in setting aside perfectionist expectations and engaging in the messy, often dissatisfying work of trying to make war less awful than it could be. This work is a privilege and a burden, and spreading that privilege and burden across more people is what this channel is all about. I want to start with a brief summary of the analysis we've conducted to get our bearings. A note here, I have incorporated Red Team comments from throughout the series, so this analysis is a bit adjusted from the previous videos, including the scoring. On the security apparatus, we flagged a decentralized military, corrupt or captured capital security institutions, a neglected Night's Watch, wide availability of low-grade weapons, and a spike in political violence. We see highly factionalized political elites and broken succession institutions, mitigated by resiliencies like a common language and traditions of power sharing and intercultural exchange. We're tracking instances of minority group marginalization and pockets of ethnic tensions in Dorne and around the Iron Islands, a recent history of armed conflict and atrocities with no justice or reconciliation to speak of, mitigated by some religious plurality and interfaith tolerance, as well as by the apparent concentration of identity-based vitriol at the elite level throughout many of the kingdoms. On the economy, we have exorbitant national debt despite decent resource diversity and strong productivity, signaling poor decision-making at the top. We have a noticeable wealth gap, the presence of slums and a notable number of orphans, poor opportunities for upward social mobility, and the concentration of wealth in a particular group, but no evidence of brain drain yet, though the relevance of this indicator is lower in this pre-modern feudal context. On politics, we have a winner-take-all political system with an unchecked executive, a long history of irregular political transitions, rampant corruption, and reports of political assassinations, all straining the conqueror's legitimacy of Robert's reign, which is fading fast. We know that despite high maternal mortality rates and a mixed bag on infrastructure, the maesters help to deliver some semblance of services in education, health, and information flow. We see no judiciary independence, questionable decentralized standards for arrest leading to instances of arbitrary detention, and restrictions on freedom of speech despite decent freedom of movement and belief, and some powerful cultural due process traditions to combat the worst of executive overreach. On society, we have unpredictable Westerosi winters, but we are coming off of a long summer. We have powerful but nascent external threats with designs on overthrowing the current order in Westeros, Dany in the east, and the White Walkers Lannisters in the north, both in the early stages of acquiring weapons of mass destruction, though neither currently having operatives or allies in Westeros. We have increased displacement of wildlings in a context of no services and noticeable xenophobic rhetoric, mitigated only by geographical barriers and a recognized shared ancestry of Northerners and the Free Folk. All in, our red team adjusted scores give Westeros 25 out of 30 on cohesion, 18 out of 30 on the economy, 21 out of 30 on politics, and 23 out of 30 on society, yielding a total fragility score of 87 out of 120. This places Westeros on the upper end of the warning category of the Fragile States Index, just 3 points shy from the red alert category. So, is violence inevitable? Perhaps. Is it hopeless? Far from it. Scorecards and metrics are useful, if flawed, tools for analyzing and comparing disparate indicators and synthesizing large amounts of messy information. Now, we set about the hard, deeply human work of figuring out what the hell we're going to spend our energy on to relieve pressure, reduce harm, and make things better for people. I'm going to divide my proposed intervention recommendations into 3 different categories. Those that are applicable in a prevention timeframe, those that are applicable in a de-escalation timeframe, and those that would be applicable even after the onset of open hostilities. If you're not clear on what that means, don't worry, I'm going to walk you through it. The ideal time frame for bringing in a stabilization expert is yesterday, right? You can't start too early. The earlier, the better. If Robert had ended his rebellion, sat down on the throne and thought, crap, how am I going to run this mess of an empire? I would hope he would have called me or one of my former colleagues for advice. And if he had done so, here is what I would have proposed. One of the first things that stands out to me from our analysis is the role that Robert and Ned's upbringing played in the realm's stability. Being fostered together by Jon Arryn in the Vale enhanced their understanding of the world and built a bond that essentially kept the Seven Kingdoms peaceful for 17 years. If I were advising the Crown, my instinct would be to institutionalize and expand this. We want to take that informal tradition and turn it into a standardized exchange program for Westerosi political elites. Think about the effect this could have had. Maybe if the Starks and the Greyjoys had engaged in an exchange with their children earlier on, the Greyjoy rebellion might never have happened in the first place. Or look at Robb Stark. If the heir to Winterfell had spent a year abroad in Casterly Rock building a relationship with Tyrion, or in King's Landing learning the ropes of capital politics, he might have had more diplomatic options available to him. He might have even had the connections he needed to negotiate his father's freedom. This kind of intervention isn't expensive, but the stability dividends are massive. And from a gendered lens, you'd have to wonder if this would lead to fewer disastrous, unhappy marriages. If these men and women actually had the chance to get to know one another, to date, before being wed off for an alliance, the resulting marriages might have been more fruitful and ultimately more stable for the families involved. We established in our analysis that the lack of justice and restitution for crimes committed during Robert's rebellion is a major risk factor.
Tell your father I'm here. Tell him the Lannisters aren't the only ones who pay their debts.
If I had been advising King Robert after he took the throne, I would have pushed him to establish a special tribunal to adjudicate the crimes that took place during that war. There are a lot of ways this can look. You have things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, which exchanged truth-telling for amnesty so that an accurate account of history could be documented to help with societal grieving. You have the Nuremberg trials, which were more about holding leadership directly accountable for atrocities. An investigation into Robert's rebellion would have been incredibly hard to pull off, but if it were, it might have exonerated Rhaegar from the accusations regarding Lyanna Stark, providing the kind of closure that Robert clearly lacked, and allowing him to be more present, less obsessed with the Targaryens overseas, and more supportive to his wife and family.
I only know she was the one thing I ever wanted. Someone took her away from me, and 7 kingdoms couldn't fill the hole she left behind.
But more importantly, if Sir Gregor or Tywin Lannister had been held accountable for the sack of King's Landing, they may not have been at liberty to commit more crimes in the Riverlands later on. Even if Tywin had managed to bribe his way out of a conviction, a formal judicial process would have at least signaled that the era of total impunity was over, and it would have made him think twice before acting so atrociously again. With more than 300 years of unity under its belt and the end of the Targaryen dynasty, I think now is the time for the Seven Kingdoms to finally move to consolidate its monopoly over the means of force.
One army, a real army, united behind one leader with one purpose.
This means demobilizing the clan militias and reintegrating them into a standing national military. As we discussed in the first video of this series, the goal here is to reduce the overlap and the likelihood that different armed forces will come into competition with each other. In foreign policy circles, we call this security sector reform. Every society is different and requires a nuanced approach, so before we started designing an SSR program for Westeros, we'd need to perform a much more specific analysis of the current security apparatus. But my advice would be firm: consolidate the kingdom's armed forces under the control of the crown. Now, we don't want the crown wielding a powerful national military if it isn't also structurally and institutionally accountable to the people it governs. These two interventions, security sector reform and governance reform, have to go in tandem. Otherwise, the crown could turn the military on the population too easily. We've talked about how the Seven Kingdoms have plenty of power-sharing traditions, but almost no power-sharing institutions. I don't think we should try to overhaul the whole system or to build a new democracy from scratch. That's usually a recipe for more instability.
Maybe the decision about what's best for everyone should be left to everyone.
But I think institutionalizing representativeness in the king's small council would be a feasible, stabilizing start. What if, in addition to the Master of Coin or the Master of Ships, the council also included a formal representative from each of the Seven Kingdoms? Their role would be to advise the king and represent the interests of their specific region to the crown. This would formalize a space for the political elites to share information, which improves transparency and helps build constructive relationships between the different regions. I'm out of my depth here. It seems pretty clear to me that the king acting as the arbiter of justice is highly problematic and unstable. I don't know enough about how independent judiciaries are successfully built to be able to be specific on what's needed here, but there are experts, and if you're watching this, please weigh in the comments, who do know how to do this, and I would enlist their help. This is a really important part of the process, bringing in technical experts to advise on specific aspects of fragility. This is a consultative team exercise, and we build more stable societies together. Ultimately, until the power of the executive and the power of the judiciary are separated, Westeros' stability will be under significant strain. This one too does not play to my strengths, but if the realm is going to have a standing centralized military, it's going to need to pay for it somehow. In my field, establishing a functioning, impartial, and accountable tax system is one of the hardest parts of the job. In Westeros, reforming the tax code wouldn't just be about paying down the debt or funding increased services and security. It would be about strengthening the state-society social contract. When people pay into a system, they expect something back. If the king is spending that money on extravagant parties instead of the good of the realm, he'd face a level of institutional backlash that would actually threaten his ability to stay on the Iron Throne. So it's a mechanism for accountability that currently just doesn't exist. And then finally, this seems like an easy one, guys. Improving maternal health is not very expensive. It's sad when maternal mortality is so high. There's no need for it to be. Making it easier and safer for the people who bear and raise children to bear and raise those children, it's a no-brainer. Dividends sky high in both the economic and stability departments. Task the maesters with conducting the research and disseminating the information. Get women involved in developing and implementing the solutions. It's so silly, guys. Just get it done. Unfortunately, stabilization advisors are rarely called in during times of peace. In real life, leaders usually wait until things start to look worrying before they start asking, how do we stop this war that's starting to look more and more likely? So let's change our time frame here to make it a bit more akin to how things usually work. Let's say Ned Stark had arrived in King's Landing after Jon Arryn's death to take up his role as Hand of the King and sought me out the moment he realized just how bad things were. At that point, we're no longer in a prevention window. We are now in what's called a de-escalation window. And here's what I would propose. This is where bringing in an impartial third party becomes the priority. There's so much to discuss regarding how you actually structure successful mediations, but the short version is that mediation works best when there's a third party that has authority and respect from both sides. They need to have a general interest in seeing the dispute resolved without having their own specific interests at play in the outcome. In Westeros, I could see this mediator coming from a few different places. It could be one of the free cities in Essos that's looking across the narrow sea and getting uncomfortable with the instability. Maybe it's a smaller city-state that wants to build a stronger relationship with Westeros to help it compete with its more powerful neighbors. However, given how isolated Westeros is and some of the internal resiliencies we've already identified, I think the more advisable path would be to find that third party from within the Seven Kingdoms itself. You want someone who understands the culture and the stakes, but stands outside the immediate Lannister-Stark-Baratheon friction. I think the Citadel could serve as a very effective mediator for the Westerosi political elite. Since the Citadel is in Old Town, not the capital, it provides neutral ground. That's huge because it means characters like Robb Stark or Lysa Arryn wouldn't have to return to King's Landing where they'd be constantly at risk of arbitrary arrest. Plus, since the Maesters already control the Ravens and the flow of information, they're perfectly positioned to handle the shuttle diplomacy needed to get everyone to the table. Now, of course, there's a massive logistical hurdle here. Without air travel, getting the North or the Vale to the Reach requires guaranteed safe passage through several territories, so it's not that simple of a request, but the potential is definitely there. Regardless of whether the Citadel hosts a summit, we should be looking at them as a primary partner. In foreign policy circles, we do this all the time, or at least we used to. When the state's legitimacy is falling apart, people still need access to basic goods and services. And the smart move is to bolster local capacities that are already providing those services. One commenter even suggested that we send a maester to all major and minor keeps to maintain services information flow. I love that idea. Originally, I had also proposed this as a potential third-party mediator, but you all definitely set me straight on the state of interreligious dynamics in Westeros in the Red Team. Still, even though the state of interfaith tolerance is not as strong as I originally assessed, I think convening an interreligious body for routine engagement is an important step here. In my career, I've seen that engaging religious leaders and institutions to help address structural fragility, even when interfaith harmony is tenuous, is a common tactic with a pretty strong track record. Now, we're not talking religious fanatics here like Melisandre or the Sparrow. We're talking about convening leaders who are interested in fostering social cohesion across groups and reducing, not escalating, tensions. Such a group could brainstorm solutions and use their influence with different kingdoms and lords to push the political leaders toward a more measured, stable approach. Even if the Crown hadn't prioritized building a full-scale independent judiciary over the last 17 years, there is still a massive opportunity here for a targeted, high-level independent investigation. When figures as prominent as Jon Arryn or Bran Stark are targeted, a stable state has to legitimately seek the truth. If they had set that goal, I imagine they could have discovered fairly quickly that Peter Baelish was a common denominator. Even if an investigation had stumbled onto the truth about Joffrey's parentage, a truly independent and professional team wouldn't have necessarily had to divulge that information. The immediate mandate would be, how did the Hand die? Who tried to kill the Stark boy? In both cases, the trail leads back to Littlefinger. A formal investigation could have uncovered his role, leading to his incarceration, or at the very least his removal from power before he could do more damage. But there's another stabilization benefit here. It would have stopped Catelyn and Ned Stark from trying to play detective themselves.
I know they did it, Ned. The Lannisters in my bones, I know it.
If there were a trusted process in place, Catelyn could have stayed in Winterfell to advise Robb and care for Bran, and Ned could have focused on the actual business of being Hand. Instead, a lack of state-led investigation forced them into a do-it-yourself justice model, which is exactly what triggered the cycle of retaliation that led to the war. I think King Robert should have been much louder about his intolerance for divisive speech. We know that Robert hated the infighting, the gossip, the constant flow of misinformation in his court.
That's all the realm is now. Backstabbing and scheming and arse-licking and money-grubbing.
but he didn't actually do all that much to stop it. Now, the specifics of how you counter this type of information are definitely outside of my realm of expertise. I imagine any public campaign would require close coordination with the maesters, since they are the experts on information flow, and it probably could have included some sort of royal progress with a unifying theme. I'll let the communications experts weigh in on the how, but the what here is clear. Robert needed to use the authority of the crown to actively push back against the misinformation and the divisive rhetoric that was tearing his country apart. Given the increased number of wildlings crossing the border, I think Westeros should send an envoy to the wildlings to determine what's going on. Easier said than done, since Westeros is in open war with the wildlings, but there are bridges like Craster who could make this possible. Upon learning about the existential threat facing this aggrieved and excluded group, I would recommend that Westeros sue for peace, demobilize willing wildling combatants, and grant these groups temporary protected status. Temporary protected status, or TPS, is something we use in foreign policy when specific groups face targeted violence or atrocities. We grant them a benefit of the doubt approach to legal residency in the United States. Or at least we used to. I don't really know where this stands right now. This would mitigate the threat of Mance Rayder's army by negating its reasons for existing altogether. And I would recommend that the North be in charge of designing and implementing the program, since they have lots of land on which to settle displaced populations, and they have the joint cultural affinity to draw on.
There are good lands south of the wall. The Night's Watch will let you through the tunnel and allow your people to farm those lands.
Now, as some of you mentioned in the Red Team, this will also require a disarmament and reintegration campaign. Relocating armed or aggressive groups, or even relocating demobilized groups into areas where they are likely to be seen as threats and targeted, cannot be the solution. I know this sounds like a lot of work, but it is essentially what ends up happening later, but in a more tenuous time frame, with even fewer resources and less goodwill to draw from. So the earlier you can start this process of integration, the better. One thing I would not do, I would not recommend trying to reorganize the security forces at this point. While I argued for security sector reform as a prevention move back when Robert first took the throne, this math changes once you're in a de-escalation window.
And command them to supply 10,000 men to the Royal Army.
And if the Northerners rebel?
I'd crush them.
And these 10,000 Northern troops, would they fight for you or their lord?
With the factionalization of the political elites and the zero-sum nature of politics at the top, attempting to wrest the monopoly on violence away from the great houses right now would only backfire. The Lannisters, the Starks, the Greyjoys, the Aarons, they're all feeling incredibly vulnerable. When actors feel their survival is at stake, they cling to their security guarantees. If you were to use the power of the crown to try and take away the very thing that gives them security and autonomy, their banners, it wouldn't work. It would be seen as an act of aggression, not of reform. Instead of stabilizing the realm, it would just cause the whole situation to fracture and spiral into war much sooner. In this window, you have to work with the security architecture you have, not the one you wish you had. More often than not, a peacebuilding expert is brought in after armed hostilities have already started. This is very problematic because by this point the avenues for intervention are severely limited. However, it is a common problem that people in the peacebuilding space deal with all the time, so it's only right that we apply it to our exercise here and get the full, honest experience of the thing. So what if Tyrion came to me in the aftermath of Ned Stark's beheading? We already have armed hostilities between the crown and an armed insurgent faction, the Starks. We're now in a protection window where the primary priorities would be to protect civilian populations from harm and atrocities and to end the armed altercations between the opposing sides. Here's what I would propose. A staple intervention in any armed conflict is to be constantly pursuing a ceasefire negotiation and after that, a comprehensive peace treaty. Now, in the early seasons of Game of Thrones, we find ourselves in a situation where the conditions are not ripe for negotiated settlement. Ripeness is a theory in international war studies which posits that two underlying conditions must be reached to pave the path for a successful peace negotiation. A mutually hurting stalemate, where both parties realize that they can no longer achieve a unilateral victory and that the cost of continuing the war are higher than the costs of a settlement, and a way out, where both parties believe that a negotiated alternative exists and that the other side is a valid partner for that negotiation. But just because the situation is not ripe for mediation doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do. There are actions we can take, particularly diplomatic actions, to ripen the situation and to make the parties more likely to come to the negotiating table. Throughout the series, we do see these efforts being made. We see Robb Stark sending his mother to treat with Renly to broker an alliance, and Stannis attempting to broker a truce with his brother. This is something we call shuttle diplomacy, when two sides are not yet ready to come to the table, but they send envoys to speak with each other nonetheless, to keep lines of communication open and continue to seek avenues for negotiation. We might also choose to use what's called track 2 diplomacy. This is where we engage influential non-state actors like the maesters, high-ranking merchants, or even religious leaders to conduct unofficial back-channel talks. Unlike track 1, which is the kings and the queens, track 2 actors can discuss potential compromises without the political risk of losing face or appearing weak in the eyes of their banners. And again, if there had been an interreligious council, that would have been a natural space for these efforts. Regardless of TPS status for wildlings, Westeros at this point needs to be preparing for internal displacement in the case that the war breaks out further.
The city's drowning in refugees, Your Grace.
Shut the gates to the peasants. They belong in the field, not our capital.
This is one, again, where I need an expert to weigh in on the how, identifying sites for settlement, building infrastructure, engaging local communities to foster social cohesion and reduce tensions. It's a complex endeavor, the disaster and displacement preparedness, but ultimately it saves lives and it helps armed conflicts to end more swiftly. I was trying to think about how we can capitalize on the resiliency of the Maester's ravens, and one thought that occurred to me pulling from real-world tools is to try and use this type of information flow to create an early warning and response program. Early warning and response programs essentially crowdsource intelligence gathering and information sharing for communities likely to experience violence. Communities are trained on how to identify growing risk of attack, tracking armed group presence or militia movements, the movement of military equipment, or economic or environmental trends, and then they have secure, user-friendly methods for feeding that information into an organized system that is trying to track where the next attack against civilians might happen. Usually in the modern day, this is done digitally, but I wonder if the Citadel essentially tasked each of the maesters with being a node for collecting information from their respective villages and sending it in a regular, coordinated manner via Raven. I don't know, I guess I wonder what could have been achieved through something like this. The response part of early warning and response is the hardest part to pull off, especially if you have a weak or disinterested military. Even if you know where the next attack is likely to happen, what can you do to stop it? Well, as we discussed, weapons are pretty low grade in Westeros, which means that confident, unarmed resistance by large groups of people have a higher likelihood of success. So perhaps part of the campaign could be an organized dissemination of training on unarmed resistance and civilian protection in the context of warfare. If an entire community shows up to block a militia from preying on the population, most likely they'll back off. They'll know a lost fight when they see one. If these predatory groups start harassing people in the taverns or on the roads, having a quick community response mechanism where the community can show up and at least witness, if not intimidate them back, could have helped keep a lot of the economy still functioning because people could have been less afraid to be on the roads and continue to trade. We see this in the modern day: whistles, banging pots and pans, bird calls, radio signals. I wonder what a Westerosi equivalent would have looked like. This type of campaign could also have coordinated more grassroots humanitarian support and displacement response, identifying or bolstering quasi-underground railroad-style systems that can help civilians get to safety, even though their government doesn't give a crap about them. Ultimately, there is so much the Citadel could have done using its ravens to help keep civilians throughout the kingdom safe during the war, if they'd only recognized the tools available to them and had a bit of creative spirit. That said, this also would have increased the politicization of the Citadel in the context of the war and reduced their role as a neutral party. So there are risks, and those risks would have had to be weighed carefully in the planning and strategizing phase. Alright guys, this is the one that's most often missing, and it's easy to forget, but it pays dividends in the future. Even in the context of a brutal civil war, with no ripeness of ceasefire negotiations and no opportunity for humanitarian assistance or civilian protection, there is still something you can do, and that is document. My old bureau at the State Department had several programs we funded in this respect. Documenting abuses against children in the context of the war in Ukraine, documenting war crimes and abuses in Ethiopia and in Sudan. You might say, why bother? What is the point of documenting if you can't do anything to stop the violence? And to that question, I give you two answers. The first is that documenting makes justice after the conflict easier and swifter. As we've hammered home 1,000 times on this channel, the biggest predictor of future atrocities is past atrocities for which there's not been justice. Justice is not easy to get, but documenting in real time what is happening in a war zone helps with the huge burden of trying to achieve post-conflict transitional justice and reconciliation. The second reason documenting is important is because it's valued by those impacted. It's meaningful. I know throughout this process, there have been times when it seems like this is all an engineering exercise, right? Highly technical. But at its core, this is a human exercise, and things that are meaningful to communities under threat matter. It almost always provides value to targeted communities to have the injustices done to them recorded accurately. And so there we have it. We have 3 different stabilization plans, depending on which time frame we're working with. We have a prevention plan we could have advised King Robert to oversee once he took the crown. We have a de-escalation plan we could have handed to Ned Stark as he took over as Hand of the King. And we have a protection plan we could have handed to Tyrion, Robb Stark, Stannis, and the other warring parties once hostilities begun. Now, if you have stuck with me all the way to the end, you are probably wondering, why did I make this series and what am I hoping that you all take away? The first lesson I hope you take away is this. Stability is hard, but it is possible. When you break things down, there is method here. It's not exactly science, but it's also not witchcraft. There's pattern, there are trends. Trends are analyzable, and that analysis is applicable. If you combine human compassion with curiosity, with critical thinking, with hope, that's the sweet spot for stabilization work. Second, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Just because you can't prevent a war from happening, or just because you can't prevent every death in that war, or just because you can't craft a perfectly stable society from a fragile one, doesn't mean you shouldn't make some effort to address the fragility. It's not about perfection, it's about incremental progress, or sometimes it's just about holding the line of the status quo and trying to make things not as bad as they could be. If you can't prevent, de-escalate. If you can't de-escalate, protect. If you can't protect, advocate. If you can't advocate, document. There is always something you can do to care for the people around you. And finally, remember to look for resiliencies. People forget to look for the resiliencies. This was a challenge even for us in the stabilization space. Often, we'd be halfway through the conflict analysis before we realize that we forgot to do the resiliency analysis. Everyone wants to focus on what's wrong, on what's broken, but don't forget to ask yourself, what's working? The key to unlocking solutions and reversing the cycle is often found in what continues to work in the face of instability. So if you can't figure out where to start there. Ultimately, I want you to leave more hopeful than when you started watching this. Westeros is a mess. I'm not gonna lie. George R.R. Martin set out to create a bleak, complex world rooted in the drama of conflict and violence. And even he couldn't rid the fictional society he created from resiliencies. Resiliencies are innate to us as humans, as living, learning, loving creatures, and to the stories we tell, and that has to count for something, right? That brings us to the end of Stabilizing Westeros. I had fun, I learned a lot, and I hope you did as well. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the gray area of conflict, we need your help to keep this mission going. Make sure you like and subscribe, hit that bell to get notified when we post a new video, and let me know in the comments, what fictional war should I aim to prevent next? The War of the Ring in Middle-earth? The Civil War in Panem? There are so many aspects to stability and fragility left to explore, and the framework is as complicated as the world it aims to capture. So please let me know in the comments, what do you think we should try and stabilize next? And in the meantime, I'm Madeline Vellturo with former Feds and Friends. We used to work for government, we don't anymore, but we still work for you. And we'll see you in the next one. Peace out.